welcome to my channel. Today's video is about the top 10 watercolor supplies that I recommend for getting started out in watercolor. And here they are. Starting with number 10, the first supply that I recommend is a pencil. Watercolor can be either loose or planned, and my style and other realistic styles involving wildlife and portraits usually begin with an accurate sketch. When starting out and practicing your skills, or for more experienced artists like myself, mapping out a sketch can be helpful in planning your subject. When I sketch first, I ensure that my proportions are correct and that my composition is placed how I would like it. So here I'm just showing my lighter pencil and a regular pencil in comparison. And I do prefer working with a lighter pencil, but you can lighten up a darker pencil afterward before you lay the paint down. Once you paint on top of dark pencil, you can't erase it. So that is why I like to lighten it before I begin painting. Speaking of lightening dark pencil, my next recommended supplies, number 9, is a gum eraser. Gum erasers are also known as kneaded erasers or kneaded rubbers, and they're my favorite type of eraser to use with watercolor and in drawing because they can be shaped to erase a narrow section or flattened to lighten a large area at a time without rubbing or ruining the surface of the paper. On the left is what a brand new kneaded eraser looks like from the store, and on the right is one that I've been using for a while. Another perk about a kneaded eraser is you can get a clean surface area of the eraser just by flipping it over in your hand and picking a clean spot to erase with again. And while I was just talking here, I have been lightening that darker pencil to match the lighter pencil on the other side, just to show that it doesn't matter what kind of pencil you use as long as you have an eraser tool to make it the lightness or darkness that you prefer. Supply number 8 is a water container, and the great thing about a water container is it can be as cheap or as fancy as you would like. You can use a glass jar, a plastic jar, a margarine container, anything that you have lying around the house. I really like the one on the right because it has that scrubber on the bottom to help me get the paint out from my brush. I like to use 2 water containers, one for dirtier water and then one for cleaner water. On to supply number 7, which is a board or a panel. And what I mean by that is you want a hard surface that is not flexible to tape your paper to and keep it secure to prevent it from warping from the water that you put on your paper. I use a masonite panel usually to tape my watercolor paper to. They're very cheap, usually under $1. And I choose a size larger than the art that I'm doing, usually about 11 by 14 or 16 by 20 can fit most sizes that I work with. The only thing I don't suggest is cardboard because it's just too flimsy. For the next supply, supply number 6, I recommend tape. There are a few kinds of tape. There's artist tape, masking tape, painter's tape. I find artist tape to be sticky enough, and I also like Scotch tape. The one thing to make sure of is that your tape won't ruin your paper, and you can do a little test with that, or to loosen it, I like to use a warm setting on a blow dryer to loosen the glue so that I won't be ripping my paper when I pull up the tape. I also sometimes use washi tape in my sketchbook. Number 5, masking fluid. Masking fluid is used to preserve the whites of your paper or the sections you want to keep light between layers. I use a cheaper brush to apply the fluid, making sure to put a little coat of dish soap on the brush before applying the masking fluid and washing it again immediately after use. This helps to prevent the masking fluid from ruining your brush. Masking fluid comes in a few different forms. It comes in these jars that I'm showing you here, either blue or white, or it comes in a pen for finer detail, and there's the pen right here. I like to use different types depending on what I'm doing. For larger areas, I use the tubs. For smaller areas, I use the pen. You can see right here that it gives you nice fine lines, and on this portrait, I used it to mask off the light reflecting in her eyes so that I could paint over top, and then when it's completely dry, I just peeled it off and the white was still there. One thing to be very careful of when you're using masking fluid is that it dries completely before you try to remove it or paint on it. Supply number 4 is a palette. In watercolor, a palette has 2 meanings. Number 1 is a place to store your paints, and number 2 is a surface for color mixing. And some of them are both, so it can get confusing when you're searching for what you need. First, I'll go over a surface for color mixing. So for a surface, I prefer to use a porcelain or ceramic palette. There are ones made specifically for watercolor. They can get really expensive, or you can just use a ceramic plate from any type of home goods store. A watercolor tin like this one both holds paints in it in pan form and has a bit of a mixing surface for when you travel, so those are convenient to have. This is a plastic pellet. It also has a mixing surface and is great for traveling. One thing that I like to watch for is that the paint holder areas are all on one side, because if they're on the top as well, when you close it, they can get knocked out. So don't worry if I'm going too fast, because I will link everything that I'm talking about in the description below, as well as post a full blog article with my explanations in detail for each supply. For number 3, watercolor paint. Of course you need this, you've probably been waiting for this one. Watercolor paint comes in 2 forms. It comes in tube form and pan form. Tubes typically come in 15 milliliter sizes or a 5 milliliter size. And with tubes, you can squeeze them into the plastic pellet that I mentioned before, or you can squeeze them into empty pans, or dollop a tiny amount onto a ceramic or porcelain palette and just use what you needed for a single painting. When they're in pan form, they come in 2 sizes as well. There is a full pan, which is 5 milliliters, and a half pan, which is 2.5 milliliters. When you're shopping, it is usually the cheaper option to buy a tube and pour it into pans or use it as needed. It's just cheaper per milliliter when you're buying a tube. Having said that, when you're getting started, a starter palette with 12 to 24 colors included can be a great way to go, because buying a lot of tubes up front will be expensive. We'll link some of my recommended starter palettes below. For supply number 2, a paintbrush. Paintbrush is important in watercolor because you don't want to buy a really cheap paintbrush or think that you're getting a deal by buying a big pack of paintbrushes. The best thing you can do is invest in one nice watercolor paintbrush. A size 10 or 12 round brush is a great place to start. In Canada, the Frank Haddock Premier brush from Delta Art is about $20 for size 12, and it is so versatile. It can go to a sharp point, hold a lot of water for large washes, and do fine detail at the same time. Some other popular watercolor brands are the Silver Black Velvet brushes, Grumbacher Golden Edge brushes, and Princeton Elite. When you go into an art store, there's always someone helpful that can help you out in picking out a watercolor brush. I saved what I consider to be the most important supply in watercolor for last, and that is your paper. For watercolor, I strongly suggest using paper made for watercolors. The 2 most common types are cold press and hot press watercolor paper. I look for 100% cotton paper because it just behaves differently than paper that is not cotton, and once you get used to a certain type of paper, it's just easier. So if you learn on one type of paper and then switch to more professional paper, you kind of have to relearn. I'm going to make a separate video explaining the difference between hot press and cold press watercolor paper and doing some demos on them, but for this one I'm just going to say that for beginners I recommend cold press watercolor paper because it is the more forgiving of the 2 papers. That is it for what I consider to be my top 10 essential watercolor supplies. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please make sure to click the like button. If you'd like to see more from me, click subscribe. I do have lots of videos planned, and if you have a suggestion or question, pop it in the comments below and I will answer you there as well. Have a great one. Bye.